Hello and welcome to Military HF Radio, Episode 6, Second Generation and Third Generation Automatic Link Establishment. In this episode, we're going to talk about the background behind automatic link establishment and then wavetop level foundational knowledge on second generation ALE and third generation ALE. I like to refer to this episode as a primer. For those that might have heard about it, they are actually employing it, but they really don't understand some of the deeper understanding of how it's functioning. Towards the end of this episode, I will point you to some great resources, including the ones you see right here on this slide, the actual standards that define how this functions, so that you can read more at your leisure. You want to study a little bit deeper about how this actually works. To say that you're a professional or a subject matter expert, I think that not only are you out there in the field using it in the applied sense, but that you truly understand the theory and the science behind it. So this concept, if you're using amateur radio, I have shown you in previous episodes, and by the way, even military HF radio, that if you're trying to talk to a certain station a certain distance away, that your ability to speak with them throughout the day on that one frequency may change, such that maybe at night you're able to speak to them on a lower frequency, but during the day heavy fading occurs on that frequency. The sun comes up, the D layer starts to energize back up and absorbs certain frequencies. You need to move higher in frequency in order to speak to that same station, just as an example. Well, the problem is, how do you, each hundreds of miles away, using nothing else, and let's just assume that we're really using this the way HF should be used, and that is all other communications are down. How do you all agree upon moving to another frequency? There's all kinds of HF frequencies, and how do you move to another one higher up? How do you agree upon that? Because you may not get that word out at that time that the sun's coming up, and what you were just talking on now is no longer usable. How are you now going to communicate to go to another frequency? So automatic link establishment depends upon a priori knowledge of what frequencies we're going to move to throughout the day and ensure that those frequencies are in fact going to support that link. If you could program all those frequencies into your radio and then have a way for your radio to scan through those frequencies and send a short burst of data, and then the other radio picks that up and then can provide word back to the other one, the other radio, of the quality of the signal, link quality analysis, then the radio can make what's called soundings on every frequency, and it just says, hey, are you there? Hey, are you there? The other radio answers back when it does hear that call and respond back with the bit error rate of that short data burst back to the calling radio, and now the radio has knowledge for that specific sounding time. Where is the best frequency? What is the best frequency to communicate on? And this is huge, and it required digital signal processing. It required these more advanced radios that were starting to come out in the late 70s, early 80s. This is not a feature you would have found early 70s and older. And since then, it's extremely popular because it allows folks to just select what station, because each station gets a call sign, channel, an address ID, if you will, and you just select that, and at that time, the radio is going to go through and again do an update of the soundings and figure out what frequency is the best to communicate to the other station on. Again, depends completely on the fact that you did a good enough job on getting enough frequencies low enough to high enough to support throughout all 24 hours of the day. And this is just something that spectrum managers need to understand, that when you do that, remember I talked about VOACAP analysis, that ahead of time you do the homework and finding out, do we have all the frequencies available? So let's move on. So after the ALE system, this HF radio, and again, it could be a HF radio with this built-in, or you have a computer that's doing all of this ALE functionality and merely communicating through a radio. It could be just a normal average amateur radio. I'll show you a slide later on here in the presentation that shows that software you can use for yourself if you're an amateur radio operator. Let's go through the history. So in the 70s and early 1980s, we had early automatic link establishment systems. Few companies were testing it. They had their own way of how to implement it, which is really just simple sounding, but it was per their protocol they established. So all these radios that were made were just not interoperable with each other. Think back to the early days of cellular technology. Everybody was trying to figure out which would work, and in the end, a lot more people bought on board with this kind of worldwide standard. But even in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, there was different types of cellular technology out there that were not interoperable with each other. So in 1986-ish, around that time frame, second generation automatic link establishment was finally adopted and put together through a standard. The MIL standard 188, that time 141 alpha was the initial one. And again, the cooperative efforts of several manufacturers put together and the U.S. government. This is what supported non-governmental organizations, NGOs, other agencies within the U.S. government and other governments to be able to take advantage of automatic link establishment. It would begin to increase in usage as a lot of this radio technology eventually became more cost effective. Now in 1998 and around 1999, third generation automatic link establishment was finally adopted, and that was due to significant interest in HF during the later 80s and 90s, in which people were trying to research faster ALE methods. Second generation ALE is slow for link up. It can take 10 seconds or more in order to link up. With third generation automatic link establishment, they used faster methods in order to link up faster, and some other little bits and pieces that they added on. This overall improved capability and performance was realized in MIL standard 188-141B. It does retain backwards compatibility with 2G ALE, it's just that you revert back to 2G ALE. It's also adopted in NATO STANAG 4538, so that our NATO partners can implement what is essentially just the same standard for their radios as well. 3G is not as, I'm not going to use the word popular, but not as widespread as 2G is, mainly because 3G requires more complex system processing and also GPS timing as well involved for it. So you'll find 2G in more widespread usage due to the increased interoperability between different organizations that all commonly would have 2G. But sometimes you'll have these radios that also have 3G as well. So let's look at the technical characteristics behind second generation. Off to your right, you see a waterfall display. Within what we have is a typical narrowband HF single sideband 3 kilohertz bandwidth signal. Within that, you actually see within those boundaries around a 2 kilohertz bandwidth 2G waveform, and it is made up of what we call 8 Array frequency shift keying, 8 FSK, or also just called multi-frequency shift keying. Uses 8 orthogonal tones found between 750 and 2500 hertz. You can see those clearly visible to your right. Each tone is 8 milliseconds long, and that allows you to transmit the symbol rate of 125 baud, which is also known as 125 symbols per second, which further actually breaks down to the raw data rate of 375 bits per second. Okay, we're not talking about broadband speeds that you may be used to over the internet. Okay, it just is not supportable within this finite amount of bandwidth. The ALE data itself is broken into 24-bit frames, and of those 24 bits, there's a 3-bit preamble followed by 3 ASCII characters. In this case, it is making each of these ASCII characters out of 7 bits each. This is for the very basic second generation ALE standard. They, in future standards between second generation and even third generation, increased the amount of bits used in these frames. And instead of ASCII characters, went to representing the information in just straight binary. Okay, so then you're transmitting this. That means the radio on the other end has to have the ability to process that signal and decode it, and then be able to then pull out the ASCII characters and the rest of the ALE data. The great thing about digital communications, again, I will explain more in the next episode, but the great thing about digital communications is you're able to communicate at a much lower signal to noise ratio than you could with normal voice, because the voice may be unintelligible at the other end, whereas with digital communications and with these increased digital signal processing techniques, you can pull this data right out of the noise. And so you're able to achieve negative decibel signal to noise ratio ratings and still be able to communicate. So if you're out there in the field and you're not able to hear the other person that well, you can barely make them out, if you were just using ALE and other digital communications techniques, you're able to actually pass the word through, with whether it's with digitized voice or with actual just text data being sent back and forth. You're still able to make the most out of HF communications. And this is where the magic really is with HF, and the ability to utilize and leverage digital communications to achieve communications where you couldn't otherwise if you were using just straight analog voice. Okay, so where is this used? U.S. Army Mars uses 2G ALE amongst all of the volunteer hams that are accredited to operate in the military auxiliary radio system. We have interorganization, non-government organization, multinational partners. A whole suite of people are using 2G ALE. And I'm not going to forget about you all, amateur radio operators are using this. In fact, HF Link is the, if you want to call them, the organization, also the software that allows you to, through your computer, implement 2G ALE by hooking up any amateur radio that doesn't have built-in 2G ALE capability and be able to utilize it. And then you can not only do sounding to find out which frequency is the best to use for a specific station, you're also able to include short text messages within this protocol and be able to pass information where you might not have been able to if the analog voice was too weak to make out. So I went on, if you go to sigidwiki.org, it has a treasure trove of captured signals, all different kinds. And here you see a captured 2G ALE signal from some frequency, and the waterfall display plot is there. I'm going to go play the signal, and what I did was I used multi-PSK. It's a pretty popular digital encoding and decoding program, and in this case I have it set to decode 2G ALE. And I was wondering, hey, if this signal is uploaded onto sigidwiki.org, could you just play it back through one of these decoding programs and figure out what's in it. So here I'll show you what it sounds like. I'll play it for you. And when it was done decoding, you see this message right there. You can actually see how a ALE transmission breaks down. We got some text there. It says sounding this is from Cheyenne, which apparently is the ID of that station, and then talks about the BER, bit error rate, and then also it had some signal noise ratio information as well. So what's interesting is you notice some misspellings. Well, if you heard that transmission, you heard some crackling and popping, kind of the natural atmospheric, solar, and cosmic noise that gets injected into HF, which is, again, why people kind of don't like HF, because you get that natural noise brought into your signal. And then you see here that can, if that fading in HF or even that crackling and popping happens during some of these transmitted bits, they're going to go in error. And so then you can see here where that actually interfered with the ability for the program to decode that information properly. And it just happens. But with proper forward error correction techniques, you can hopefully make through some of that noise. But if the noise or the fading in the channel happens for much longer than some of that forward error correction takes place, or is intended for, I should say, then you're still going to end up getting some bit error. This is another reason why a frequency that's potentially usable may not be usable, because just at that time of the day, it is incurring a lot of noise, a lot of fading. And that's why ALE is going to go between different frequencies to try to see which one's the best. So on to third generation automatic link establishment. In this standard, unlike 2G ALE, 2G ALE is asynchronous. In this case, 3G ALE is synchronous, in which all of the radios are timed such that they're all looking at the same block of time to pass a message or to receive a message. Unlike 2G ALE, where everybody's just blindly going through all the channels not synced. And so eventually they're going to tie and link into each other as they're all testing each channel, or on the receive side, they're receiving on every channel and flipping through, and eventually they link up. Whereas with 3G ALE, it's intended that they're all going to be transmitting or receiving and listening to each other at the same time, or attempt to. So that requires GPS, and it requires some way to ensure that everybody's got the same time. Typically in a 3G ALE network, we set up a time of day server to ensure that you have a station that can establish what is the correct synchronized time. We also have additional language within 3G ALE and definitions. We have dwell groups, we have limited call signs, we have shorter burst transmissions, and that allows for more rapid intervals of scanning. You can typically add more stations to a 3G ALE net. They're not unlimited. Some people have been employing 3G ALE nets that have only up to 50 IDs, users, and with 2G ALE maybe just 30. Or it could be a limitation of just how that radio is allowing you to input that information. So just by looking at the waterfall and also listening, it is much different than 2G ALE. And it actually increases the robustness of what the channel conditions it can work in, because it's employing more advanced forward error correction techniques, and it has a much different way of transmitting the information. It can also transmit the information much faster. We're going to look at the ALE data stack, where you would apply this to, let's say, just internet communications. You have 7 layers. We have application layer at the top and physical layer at the bottom, and everything in between, and I'll explain those here shortly, but you have the open systems interconnect. So in this case, automatic link establishment works in the data link and physical layers, but in the case of how it's functioning, just the data link layer. There is no application layer, presentation, session, transport, or network, also known as internet protocol communications going on. So what it's doing is merely trying to set up the link between radios. Once that link's set up, then we could flow network layer, transport, session, presentation, application all above that, but this is to actually link up everybody. This would be very similar to if you had a bunch of computers on a network and they are operating connected. They're trying to figure out, well, who has that IP address. Before they can do that, they got to discover MAC addresses at the data link layer, who's where, who's on the network. In this case, we're going to go over wireless to figure out where is everybody and what frequency are we going to agree upon is the best frequency to communicate on. Well, we take for granted in a wired communication scheme such as IEEE 802.3 that you're connected on the network via a wire, and that's the only place you're going to be communicating on. Whereas in wireless on HF, we're going to negotiate between several different frequencies, which one's the best. Once that's established, then we can start letting the rest of the information flow. So on a radio that's going to make an ALE call, we are going to start off over here at transmit and bring that information through down the stack, as we say, to the ALE sublayer, where you have the ALE protocol establish ALE words. What is optional, just depending on if you have a radio that's employing encryption or not, you have the protection sublayer. This is then where this information gets encrypted, then goes through the forward error correction sublayer. For the purposes of MIL standard 188.141 Bravo, we are using GOLAY codes. It's usually a 2412 GOLAY code, and then it gets interleaved, add redundancy, and then those bits then go through the radio. And depending on whether or not this data link layer is included and built into the radio, or if this is all being handled by your computer and then sending that information to your physical layer, is quite literally your radio. It's the modulator, transmitter, antenna. Okay. Then it gets pushed over the air and received by the distant end. It goes through the antenna, the receiver, gets demodulated, and then that brings the information into either the rest of the section of the radio that does the decoding, or it gets brought into a computer, a separate computer system that then does this. Okay, so it gets brought in, gets deinterleaved, GOLAY decoder, pattern synced, then brought through the decryption algorithm that then brings out the word sync, and then finally the ALE protocol brings out that information to your radio, where it is establishing and keeping track of the soundings built in, or if this gets brought into your computer program to do all that same functionality. Okay, amateur radio operators. I know some of you are watching this. All you military folks, just hold on, but I am going to include you in this conversation. So you have HF Link. This is the wide program for amateur radio operators to get in on this through the MIL standard 188.141 alpha, and also employing 188-110 modem to do more of the digital communication sides of the house. I'll talk more about that next episode. Just go to www.hflink.com and you can see information like how to download this program. you can go down to the link you see there at the bottom, hflink.com/standards, where they brought all of those standards, MIL standards, together in one place so that you can click on them, download them, start reading through them. They're all for public distribution, unlimited distribution. Anybody here that's watching this can do that, and then you can get into the deep detail of how this all works. Again, this, to make this not go as long, and I know I'm kind of a little long-winded right here, but I want to do wave top level here to kind of get you a good primer, get you interested in this, and then can send you on your way to access more of this information. Right here is a screenshot of what's called PC ALE, developed by folks part of this whole HF Link program, in particular Charles Bryan, G4GUO. And you've got an area here that shows you what probably looks very similar to that waterfall you saw earlier. Okay, you get the 3 kilohertz wide bandwidth for that channel. And then you've got the 8 FSK signaling going on right here. You can send your info. Here we have an amateur radio call sign in this case. And then paired up with this message, not necessarily a sounding message, we have text data being sent. It says send 500 gallons of water and 1,000 MREs to Shelter 5. Amateur radio operators are out there helping in some kind of disaster relief. Look at this. How about that? You've got a way to track these messages, to read back on them in case you forget. You don't have to sit there and scribble out everything listening to somebody speak this information, but you're now sending it digitally. And even in a weak signal environment, this digital information is able to have a higher success rate of decoding on the other end. Okay. So for all the people interested in the whole military HF radio aspect, and because I know I have been slighting other countries in the past, talking mainly US-centric, I wanted to kind of show you a breadth of other radios that are out there. Got the Harris PRC 160, the latest HF radio out of the US, and I also listed the standards that have come built in for the most part. We'll talk about Barrett here in a second, but you have the Fed standard 1045, which essentially is 2G ALE, but more on the federal level. Same interoperability though. Then 141B, 3G ALE STADAG 4538. Then you have the Barrett PRC 2090, and this particular radio has built-in 2G. If you want to do 3G, if I remember correctly, you had to plug in like this additional external controller to do that. The PRC 2090, popular radio from Barrett, Australian company. Then you have Codan, another popular, very popular HF radio company out of Australia. They're 2110, including the same standards. And then the Thales TRC 3700 radio, they're in France again. And on all these particular radios I selected because they are man-pack with radios that you connect to them, put on your back, go out in the field and operate. Okay, there are many other radio manufacturers that have radios with 2G, 3G. It's just that they're more meant for mobile or base station operation. ICOM makes them, also makes federal 2G standard radios. There's the MICOM, Motorola MICOM HF radios as well. And also there are, if I can get their name right this time, Collins. If you remember from back in the day, Collins, they're used to be Rockwell Collins, and now they're officially retitled, I think, Collins Avionics. But they're making latest and greatest base station radios as well. Okay, and again, I've already warned all of my Navy folks in previous episodes, I'm not slighting you. I care about you all too. It's just that I'm going to focus on these types of radios, but of course there's many other HF radios that are used in ships, and for the Air Force folks watching as well, there's many other specific HF radios made for aircraft. What is the future of ALE? Believe it or not, we're going on to a 4th generation. You're like, wow, everybody's copying cellular technology. Well, just the way it's going, but it's not the same, obviously. So 4th generation HF automatic link establishment. we are now taking advantage of wideband HF. Remember when I talked earlier about narrowband? We're talking about a 3 kilohertz single sideband signal. Now there are all these radios, PRC 160 is one of them, utilizing wideband HF, where you have a lot wider signal than 3 kilohertz, a lot wider. We're looking anywhere between 24 and 48 kilohertz. And because of that extra bandwidth, we can actually send data at a higher rate. More bandwidth equals higher data rate. And so now we can use automatic link establishment as well to make use of that and have a faster standard. So where do you go to read up on this? A paper by Dr. Eric E. Johnson has a paper here, and though I have it listed here, Wideband ALE, the next generation of HF, I will show you how you can actually access that. So for further reading, I really want to pay homage to the over 41 papers that Dr. Eric E. Johnson from New Mexico State University has been able to provide this community. He's not only wrote papers on advancing technology in HF radio, but has been a writer of these standards that I've been talking about. This is absolutely impressive. This is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 papers of the 41. I just wanted to show you these to you. You can access them. He's got his own personal website from New Mexico State University, http://traceBase.nmsu.edu/ejohnson.html. And then you can, I would say about 80% of them are linked to a paper you can actually download and read. Some of them are not available because you would have to actually pay money to the subscription and the publisher that allows you to actually access them. But he's got about 80% of them you can access via his website, which is fantastic. And from there, you can really read into what's going on with the latest and greatest. Some of you all are wondering that this stuff was all designed 20, 30 years ago, which it was. But even then, we're coming out with newer standards. These researchers are advancing the science over all of these years. Everybody thought HF radio was alive, then it was dead again, it was alive. It's been always having folks directing their research efforts at it. And it is only right that we are able to read these papers and understand where these folks have been taking the latest and greatest in digital communications, automatic linked establishment, and HF. So on that note, my next episode, we'll be talking about digital communications. I will teach it as I have taught it to cadets at West Point. So we'll talk about the very basics of digital communications and work up enough to where we meet back to where I was talking about 8FSK, or I was talking about forward error correction. So you better understand what that was all about. It was just wave top levels in this episode. So I thank you for staying with me so far. If you like what you've been watching and you want to get linked into the next episodes that get posted and notified, please subscribe, please like, and stay tuned for more amazing information on HF Radio.